Good evening and welcome. I'm Doug Paul, a board member of the Foreign Policy Association, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome General David Petraeus to this Foreign Policy Association discussion on Afghanistan. General Petraeus is without question the most revered military commander of his generation and one of the greatest American generals in history. He graduated with distinction from the United States Military Academy at West Point and served 37 years in the Army. He's the only person in Army history to be the top graduate of both the physically demanding U.S. Army Ranger School and the intellectually challenging U.S. Army's Command and General Staff School. He also received a master's and PhD degrees from Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs. He excelled at every assignment, and it's not surprising that he had a rapid rise to the rank of four-star general. He led troops in combat on 5 different commands and wrote the manual on counterinsurgency warfare that's still in use today. He's been given numerous awards for valor and service, including awards from 13 foreign countries. The general's last command was as commander of the International Security Assistance Force and Commander U.S. Forces Afghanistan from July 4th, 2010 to July 18th, 2011. Following retirement from the military and after Senate confirmation of a vote of 94-0, he served as director of the Central Intelligence Agency, giving a global overview of the terrorist activities around the globe. In addition to prestigious teaching posts, General Petraeus is currently a partner of the investment firm Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts, and is chairman of the KKR Global Institute. There is no one more qualified for our discussion this evening on Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a country that's been in conflict for many, many years. America went to Afghanistan shortly after the attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center to remove al-Qaeda and the Taliban as the ruling forces of the country and to kill or capture Osama bin Laden. The Taliban were pushed out and bin Laden was killed, but when the US forces withdrew from the country earlier this year, the Taliban very quickly retained control. General, first of all, on behalf of the Foreign Policy Association, I want to thank you for your outstanding service to our nation. Afghanistan, taking stock. First of all, importantly, what are the lessons we've learned from over 20 years in the country?
Well, first of all, Doug, thanks very much for the invitation to do the event with Foreign Policy Association. As a longtime user of the Great Decisions products over the years in my various teaching assignments, I want to thank you all for what you have contributed to the dialogue of the day on the major issues that are typically facing the United States. As to what lessons we have learned, I'm not entirely sure that we've learned all these lessons, but it seems to me that there are certain lessons that we do need to learn. Interestingly, I've actually been working on something that will identify the 10 major factors that prevented us from achieving all that we could or arguably should have in our 20 years in Afghanistan. I think foremost among those factors, and a real lesson that we do need to learn, is to recognize that when it came to Afghanistan, we never really committed what was necessary there for about 9 years. We literally did not get, as I used to term it, the inputs right in Afghanistan until late 2010. So keep that in mind now. We invaded in late 2011 after the 9/11 attacks. We toppled the regime because they refused to eliminate al-Qaeda, the sanctuary that al-Qaeda enjoyed, in which the 9/11 attacks were planned and the initial training of the attackers was conducted. All of those were shattered. We didn't do it all that well in certain respects, in Operation Anaconda in particular. After taking down the Taliban regime, we did not nab Osama bin Laden before he got away. And in fact, we did not actually get him until the late spring of 2011, when coincidentally I was the commander in Afghanistan. And we failed to capitalize on the opportunities very early on. What happened is once we took the regime down, we shifted our focus fairly quickly in 2002 to a campaign that the administration seemed to be headed to doing, which was the campaign in Iraq. I happened to be a two-star general commander of a division when we launched the invasion of Iraq in March of 2003. And frankly, from that point on, Iraq was the main effort. As Admiral Mullen some years later used to say when he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, in Iraq, we do what we must. In Afghanistan, we do what we can. So Afghanistan was always sort of the supporting effort. And it wasn't until after the surge in Iraq, during which we drove violence down by some 85% in the 18 months of that surge, put Iraq on a very good trajectory, frankly, and it stayed on that for a good 3.5 years until the prime minister tragically undid what we had all achieved together. But it was in that period that finally, first the final months of the Bush administration and then the new Obama administration could turn and focus on Afghanistan, where the situation was not going well, where in fact the Taliban had the momentum and we're losing ground pretty steadily there. And as a result of that renewed emphasis on it, again, a modest increment during the Bush years, an initial increment during the Obama years of additional forces, and then the substantial increase following the Obama policy review in 2009, announced in late 2009, that increase concluded in late 2010, when again, coincidentally, I was the commander, although I did have some influence on this as the commander of US Central Command, in other words, the boss of the commander in Afghanistan. It was General McChrystal, his analysis and his work as the commander on the ground that really set this on the right trajectory. There were certainly some additions we made, but again, we're talking about 9 years now that it took us to get the inputs right. And by inputs, I don't mean just the level of military resources, but also diplomatic capabilities, the intelligence, development, all of the other elements of a comprehensive civil military campaign, funding as well, a big deal. And then frankly, the right strategy. We really didn't have the right approach for a number of years, nor did we have the right organizational architecture to implement that particular approach. And there's lots of other details to this, including how we prepared our forces, the road to deployment, the creation of the AFPAC Hands program, a whole host of initiatives that finally enabled us to get it right in late 2010. But as was announced in the same speech during which the buildup was announced at West Point, we began to draw down in July of 2010, and that continued. Early on, it was on the basis of conditions that warranted that drawdown, but pretty quickly, it was clear that we were intent on drawing down. And we told the enemy, another lesson we need to learn is that if you want to negotiate from a position of strength, don't tell your enemy that you really want to leave. And then later on, in fact, just tell them you're desperate to leave, which is essentially what we did in the agreement that was reached in Qatar last year, which ultimately led this administration, albeit to extend the time by which we would be withdrawn, but nonetheless to carry through with that agreement. So again, if you're going to commit to something and you have an opportunity, because again, the level of violence in Afghanistan was very, very low for a number of years. I remember going there at Secretary Rumsfeld's request as a 3-star general on my way home from the 3-star tour in Iraq to do an assessment in Afghanistan. This is September of 2005. The level of violence was vastly lower in Afghanistan than it was in Iraq, and that largely continued throughout. I was astonished that people drove themselves around in soft-skin SUVs in Kabul, and again, a much more relaxed situation there than was already the case in Iraq. So that is the single biggest issue, I think, that we were always seeking a way to exit rather than a way to actually manage the situation. Another pretty big lesson, I guess, that we need to learn is to objectively assess the situation and to recognize if it is one of those where you can't win. I mean, the problem in Afghanistan, in a way in which it was vastly different from Iraq, was that because of the sanctuaries that the Taliban and the Haqqani Taliban, another element of their network, the Islamic movement, Uzbekistan, Al-Qaeda and others had on Pakistani soil, you could never really put the kind of pressure on them that we were able to put on the Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Sunni insurgent leadership in Iraq, and also the Iranian-supported Shia militia in Iraq as well. So again, very, very vastly different situations. And it was for that reason that when I had the confirmation hearing for Afghanistan and then subsequently as the commander, I cautioned Congress, do not expect us to drive violence down by 85% like we did in Iraq. The situation's very differently. And I went back to the first slide in the briefing after I did the assessment for Secretary Rumsfeld that was titled, Afghanistan does not equal Iraq, and laid out all the factors in which it was very, very different. And frankly, much more difficult and challenging than Iraq, even though Iraq was several orders of magnitude greater in violence at the height of the fighting there.
General, you've been critical about how we left Iraq, and you very correctly predicted sort of what was going to happen or what happened. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, again, number one, I felt that there were viable alternatives that were sustainable in terms of the expenditure of blood and treasure. Those are the metrics by which you measure sustainability for the United States and indeed for our coalition countries. We didn't have a battle loss in the final 18 months right up until that tragic suicide bombing at the Kabul International Airport. Yes, in part because of an agreement that we had with the Taliban. Keep in mind that that agreement was reached with the Taliban without the Afghan government, the elected Afghan government, being at the table. It was essentially to give the Taliban what they wanted, which is that we would leave. For that, we pressured the Afghan government to release 5,000 detainees of Taliban who greatly increased the ranks of the Taliban to help carry out the simultaneous offensive that ultimately is what toppled the Afghan forces and the Afghan government. The problem that I foresaw was that we underestimated the psychological impact on Afghan leaders, Afghan forces, even Afghan citizens of the announcement that the US was going to withdraw. And then we clearly did not appreciate the possibility, and you thankfully kindly noted that several months before the collapse, when I realized that all the contractors were leaving who maintained the sophisticated US rotary and fixed wing aircraft, which are critical to the entire defensive concept for Afghanistan and the security forces, when they were going to be withdrawn, I realized the operational readiness rate of this will decline. And at some point, Afghan forces are going to be out on the periphery of the country protecting what they have to protect. There's no option. You have to protect population centers and critical infrastructure. The Taliban can mass on these and possibly could do it simultaneously at different locations. And the whole concept on which the defense of Afghanistan was built, that you have, say, 100 or so thousand soldiers out around all these locations. Police gives some help, but not a huge amount in the tough times. And then you have a very large strategic reserve and some local tactical reserves. And the idea is that when they get hit, then the Afghan Air Force, which has rotary wing Black Hawk US sophisticated helicopters, some Little Bird attack helicopters, some fixed wing attack aircraft, and then transport C-130s Hercules that you'll remember all the way back from your own time in uniform a few decades back. They respond and they bring reinforcements, and the reinforcements are quite high quality. These are the commandos, a good 25 or 30,000 of them. There's really no alternative to that kind of approach in a country that is vast, is very mountainous, and has limited road infrastructure. And that road infrastructure can be cut by the Taliban to prevent you from reinforcing from any kind of distance. So that is crucial. And when I realized that our forces are going to leave, 25 to 3,500, that means that all the coalition, which is about 8,500, they have to leave, because if we're not there, they don't feel comfortable being there. And then we're going to have to withdraw the 18,000 or so Western contractors who maintain the sophisticated US aircraft that we insisted on providing, instead of allowing Afghanistan to continue to get the old sort of Soviet or Russian style aircraft, much simpler, much less capable, but adequate and much more maintainable by the Afghans. In any event, when I realized that could happen, that's when I said that I fear a psychological collapse of the Afghan forces, and it will be epidemic, because what will happen is you'll have a couple of cases, and we did, where this will work. They'll reinforce, they'll fight, they'll hold them off, and then they'll return the reinforcements. It happened in north of Kabul, it happened southwest out in the Battle of Kandahar for a while, some other locations. But I said, if they get multiple attacks, get overwhelmed, and all of a sudden, because the operational readiness has declined because they're not maintained, you're going to have forces out on these defensive missions who realize that no one's coming to the rescue with reinforcements. There's going to be no close air support, which is critical to that. And by the way, we'd already withdrawn the individuals that bring that really close, our joint tactical air controllers that were part of the headquarters and advise and assist elements that we had with Afghan forces. When that goes away and they realize there's no close air support, there's no reinforcements, there's no emergency resupply, and there's no aerial medevac, why are they going to keep on fighting? And you also local political leaders that will be in dialogue with the Taliban and say, okay, let's not destroy the city, let's just hand it over to them. Once that happens, there will be an epidemic of this, and you'll see a pretty rapid collapse. And tragically, that is what happened. And obviously, we underestimated, in our government at least, the speed at which that could happen. And then the possibility that the central government might do the same thing with Kabul and say, let's not condemn Kabul to another kind of outcome that it had during the previous civil war before the Taliban took control, when Kabul was shelled on all sides from different warring factions. And so President Ghani decided, I presume on very short notice, to leave. He did leave, and then the Taliban basically rolled into Kabul. That meant, of course, though, that our soldiers had already left, with the exception of a security battalion or so around the US Embassy, but all of our diplomats, development workers, a number of intelligence officers, and then a lot of our partners were all left behind. That meant you had to go back in with double the number of forces we had before we withdrew, just to secure Kabul International Airport and to conduct what really was a logistical marvel or miracle, an extraordinary achievement, to withdraw 120,000 or so of our citizens, green card holders, partners, and others, but by no means all that we should have. There are tens of thousands that we have left behind who are either approved special immigrant visa holders with family members or in the process of applying for that. And to do that, by the way, they have to have served 2 years on the ground with our soldiers as battlefield interpreters. We have a real moral obligation to them, and we really have not discharged that by any means fully. In any event, that's what ultimately happened. I mentioned it was a logistical miracle, but it was a very chaotic situation, needless to say. It was not an orderly departure by any means.
Right, but now we have the Taliban, we've got the Haqqani network, and we've got ISIS all kind of somehow mixed in. How do they relate to each other, and who should we be most afraid of?
Well, the Islamic State, I think, is probably the organization that we should be most concerned about in Afghanistan, keeping in mind that they are fighting the Taliban and the Haqqani. Of course, now what you have is the government is essentially a mix of Taliban and Haqqani Taliban. These are two different elements of Afghan insurgents. The Taliban had their sanctuary in Pakistan to the south of Afghanistan in Baluchistan province outside Quetta. That's why it's called the Quetta Shur, as I used to remind my Pakistani partners and asking them when they were going to eliminate these sanctuaries from their soil that made it so difficult for us to bring the really kind of crushing pressure on their leaders that we would have wanted to achieve. And then the Haqqani network came out of the western part of Pakistan, the very mountainous federally administered tribal areas north of Waziristan in particular, where some of the other groups were as well. They did a considerable degree of collaboration. The overall structure had a mix of those two, and that's what the government has, although there is discord between the Haqqani network and the Taliban. And the leader of the Taliban has been spending most of his time southwest of Kabul in Kandahar, the original birthplace province that was the birthplace of the Taliban. And the Haqqani are the ones that are more ensconced in Kabul with Taliban leaders there as well. The irony is, of course, that you have a minister of interior now who not only is sanctioned by the United States, but has a $5 million bounty on his head for extremist activity that he's done in the past. But they're the ones that are going to try to govern a country now whose economy is in collapse, whose banking system will collapse, whose ability to feed and provide basic services and electricity to the people is already greatly diminished, and puts this country of probably still 38 million or so, down from 40 million, at enormous risk of an entire humanitarian catastrophe. Now, the Islamic State is fighting the Taliban and the Haqqani. They would love to establish some substantial sanctuaries, perhaps even a miniature caliphate of some type in Afghanistan. And of course, if you remember when they had the caliphate in northern Iraq and northeastern Syria, they instigated, directed, inspired, encouraged attacks in Western Europe that were quite serious for our major NATO allies and partners. And this was a huge challenge for them. They were also recruiting thousands of would-be fighters, disaffected individuals from Europe and elsewhere, many of whom still have not gone home. So again, that is a force to be worried about, and it straddles the Afghan-Pakistan border. Again, it's very mountainous there. And the Taliban now are having to go after them because the Islamic State have been attacking Shia mosques in a Sunni majority country in the same way that Al-Qaeda in Iraq tried to foment discord between and real fighting between Sunni and Shia in Iraq. They would love to touch off some kind of civil war. I don't think they're going to be able to achieve that, but they are certainly carrying out horrific attacks, and some of them are suicide attacks, more attacks than generally get any kind of prominence in the press right now. You also see the emergence of resistance groups, and these are some of the familiar elements that fought against the Taliban when they had it during the civil war of the early 1990s in the wake of the Soviet withdrawal. And they're regrouping, they're getting organized. Some of them may actually even get some helicopters from those that flew outside Afghanistan rather than allow them to be seized by the Taliban. So it's going to be a very, very difficult situation. The Taliban, I believe, are going to find that it's much harder to be counterinsurgents and have to protect everything than it is to be insurgents and just attack where you want to attack and then go back into the hills and plan the next offensive. And they're going to find out that it is vastly more difficult to govern and to run an economy and so forth some 20 years after they last did it, given the really quite considerable strides that Afghanistan did make. By the way, I want to look, the Afghan government that collapsed was without question imperfect. It had many shortcomings or elements of it that were corrupt. It was maddening and frustrating to deal with, but surely that was a much better alternative, not just for us, because they allowed us to, and they were partners in the fight against the Al-Qaeda remnants, which are still there, by the way, as well, although they have generally been a bit more aligned with the Taliban than not. Now the Islamic State, and of course our enemies now run the country. And again, they're going to take the country back to the 7th century interpretation of Islam that they employed in governing the last time. And And again, they are not at all equipped to manage the economy that has, quote, prospered over the last 20 years in ways that it certainly had not previously. And it's a country in which far fewer people are doing agriculture. A lot of them migrated to the cities. In some respects, a result of this sort of war economy that we did foster to a degree. And that's a lesson we need to learn about not getting impatient and throwing money at problems and so forth. The problem always being, though, that we saw end dates and an impatience. And so you do what you need to do to try to achieve all the progress you can in the time that you have the forces and resources.
But without humanitarian assistance, can the Taliban survive? It seems as though the country is imploding right now. It's a humanitarian disaster. And
well, they will survive because there's no viable alternative to them. But what you would see is a country that just has huge numbers of people who are literally starving, and some will starve to death. You already have these terrible situations, well documented, of individuals who've just run out of all the money they have and are selling young girls as future brides to other families. Again, already a tragic situation. There will be, I'm pretty certain, quite considerable humanitarian assistance, but it will not be enough. There will be enormous pressure on us to release the funds that have been frozen. It's somewhere in the order of $8 or $9 billion, but even that is only half of the normal budget that they would get from the United States and other donors and other sources in the course of a given year. So they're in a very, very difficult situation. And funding from the IMF and the World Bank is obviously frozen as well. I think some of that could be made very conditions-based and perhaps could be released in some fashion in that way. There are also various options that are already being implemented to provide humanitarian assistance directly to the people so as not to enable or to enrich or to empower the Taliban.
I know there's a number of non-for-profits have still large numbers of people. I think the IRC has 1,700 employees in Afghanistan today. So people are working hard to try and help, but it seems as though they're going to need a lot of money to make it happen.
Well, they are. And again, we are already the biggest donor to that. But it's, again, nothing like the kind of funding that we typically provided before. Keep in mind, we also paid all the salaries for the roughly 300,000 or so Afghan National Security Force members and all of their operating expenses. So where they're going to find that money, again, is beyond me as well. They may turn a blind eye to some of the illegal narcotics operations, the opium products, which they actually in the past controlled in certain areas such as Helmand province and profited from it very handsomely. But even if they did that in a full scale, and they actually said they were going to make that illegal, but even if they did not, it's just again going to be a drop in the bucket compared with what it is that they actually need. So they're in a very, very tough situation, and so frankly is Pakistan. Ironically, Pakistan's leaders had a little bit of celebration that the Taliban succeeded, again, noting that they never were willing to deny the Taliban or Haqqani the sanctuary on their soil, which put us in a very, very difficult position. But they're going to be, again, the recipient of the largest number of refugees out of the country. And they're already a pretty fragile economy in a fragile state. So this is going to make life much more difficult in Pakistan as well.
Meanwhile, I mean, I've been told that there's trillions of dollars worth of mineral resources in Afghanistan. They have lithium, they have cobalt, they have a lot of these rare earth minerals, which are going to be critical going forward. And the Chinese are in there with mining rights, doing a lot of work in Afghanistan. Is that a troubling situation? And I mean,
it would be troubling if it were actually ongoing. The truth is that the Chinese had a copper mine that was south of Kabul in northern Logar province. They invested, I think it actually was hundreds of millions of dollars in it. It had a lot of potential, but they ended up on the receiving end of some rockets and mortars from the Taliban or the Haqqani, and they left. And that was all the way back in my time as the commander. Indeed, you can shovel lithium out of the ground, literally with a shovel. And so the mineral blessings that they have are extraordinary. We did a study again during the time that I was a commander. Keep in mind that was the height of the effort. We had all these resources during that period. And we believe that there were roughly $2 trillion worth of minerals in the ground. The problem is getting them out. You have none of the human capital. You don't have the physical capital, plant, lines of communication, transportation, refinery. All of the aspects of this that you need are just not there in the numbers that are required. And it is not easy to establish it either. It's a country with a very high degree of illiteracy. You've had a huge brain drain. Anybody, obviously, who could leave and who had money and passports that would allow them to do that, many numbers of those have done that, and they did it during the period when they started to see what was coming. So this is a much, much more challenging task. I don't think you'll actually see China rushing in, nor will you see China replacing the resources that we and the Japanese and British and others have contributed over the years. It's just not their model. As you know, what they do in the Belt and Road Initiative is they provide loans to countries, generally to build infrastructure that China either would like to employ in some facet, or that does indeed provide the kind of mineral extraction or other activities that they are seeking. And so, and there's just not the receiving end for this, even if they went in, as they often do, with their own labor, construction materials, and all the rest of that. It's a very, very challenging situation. And the security situation is by no means sufficient, I don't think, in their mind, given the threat posed by the Islamic State and resistance forces and others, that they will go in there in a very substantial way. I could imagine them going back into the copper mine south of Kabul, seeing how that goes. But even then, it is just not easy to get that out of the country or to process it or what have you. So a lot of effort. We would have done that, I can assure you, when we had the money to do it. We did have a variety of schemes that were very modest that we hoped, if the security could be stabilized, that we could build those just basically in the profits. I mean, I think we were exporting 30 or 40,000 barrels of oil a day out of an old oil facility in the northern part of the country that looked like a Rube Goldberg experiment, but it worked. And we actually charted, okay, here's the profit, we plow it back in, we keep expanding it, you refurbish it, you do this and that. But it just could not be sustained because of the security challenges and a variety of other issues that you ran into there. So
it's a country with $2 trillion worth of assets and basically nothing coming out right now, other than
very little coming out.
Opium is their major export, I take it.
And if your major export crop is illegal, it is really hard to have rule of law.
Yeah, that is.
But even and tragically this year, one of the crops that is actually very famous is the pomegranate harvest.
Right.
A lot of that down in the southern part of the country. We did a lot of work to try to help them refurbish that whole industry. And again, it requires an entire value chain. It's not enough just to give them, I don't know, seeds, plants, fertilizers, you name it. It needs a lot more than that. Some of it needs refrigeration, it needs transport. It needs, again, all the expert methodologies. That harvest was horrible this year, and the overall agricultural harvest was the worst in 35 years because of a serious drought. The problem is these every 35-year droughts have been coming now every 5 years or so because of climate change. And so that's another factor in why this winter is going to be so desperate for the Afghan people.
Wow, it's a bad situation. Afghanistan has been known as sort of the graveyard of different empires over the centuries. And obviously, we wound up in a bad situation. Are you concerned about the US military and its ability to compete around the world? The Chinese obviously are growing rather dramatically. What's your thought about kind of the state of the military, the US military today, as it faces these multiple adversaries around the world?
Well, there's no question that we have to pedal very fast to ensure that our capabilities are sufficient to ensure deterrence. And of course, the most important relationship in the world right now is that between the US and its partners and allies and China. The recent hypersonic test that was conducted by China, especially the final maneuver of it, normally they just glide once they're released, was alarming. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, perhaps a tiny bit of hyperbole, but not much, said that that was a Sputnik-like event. So there's no question that our military has its marching orders, but let's recognize that, you know, this was not a defeat on the battlefield by any means. This was a withdrawal from the ring. This isn't something where, again, we were limping across the border as were the British forces when they did that famous withdrawal, and literally one person survived the entire expedition, the surgeon, perhaps so that he could actually report how devastating the losses were. This was a strategic setback. I think that was the word, again, used by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs in quite a forthright testimony. But when it comes to what we need to do with China, again, it's a very different set of capabilities. This will, to be fair to the administration who has made this as one of the reasons why we need to get out of Afghanistan, is so that we're not using forces and financial resources there that we need to use elsewhere. Although, again, as I explained earlier, I felt those are more than sustainable. $20 billion and 3,500 troops in a defense budget that's, you know, again, 740 billion, that's affordable, especially if the alternative is what I think we see in Afghanistan, which from my perspective is not just heartbreaking and tragic, but again, a strategic setback and disastrous in many respects. The other issue, of course, is that when it does come to deterrence, deterrence is based on two factors. It's a potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities, and our capabilities are extraordinary, and they're vastly greater still than what China has. We have more flat deck carriers than all the rest of the world put together. Now, you might argue we should shift some of those to smaller, autonomous AI, machine learning, still very capable unmanned systems of various types, and that is ongoing. But again, the other component of deterrence beyond capabilities is the adversary's perception of your willingness to employ those capabilities. And when you withdraw from Afghanistan, you allow others to say, see, we told you, they're not a dependable partner. They're a country in decline. And I think it's incumbent on us. And to be fair to this administration, these are brilliant individuals. I've served with all of them in previous administrations. Noting, by the way, I am not even registered in any party. I don't vote. I stayed strictly out of politics, and I held two very senior positions for a Republican administration, two for a Democratic administration. But they know that we have to demonstrate that we are a good partner. And you're seeing a lot of that right now with this flurry of activity around the threat posed by the Russian buildup on the borders of Ukraine, where we're working, I think, quite effectively with our European allies and partners to make it very clear to Russia that there would be enormous penalties and price to pay if they were once again to go into Ukraine. But again, the military, our military is extraordinary, even though the combat in which we've been engaged is different from the kind of combat that would be featured in, again, God forbid, because we don't want deterrence to break down, a conflict between two great powers could be extraordinarily just very, very dangerous and destructive, to put it mildly. But the fact that we have employed all these assets in this really quite demanding scenarios of using all of these intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, the targeting process, and so forth, that is a huge advantage. And our commissioned and non-commissioned and warrant officer corps, in particular, are the most combat experience that we have ever had in our history. It is not uncommon for individuals to have spent many years in combat, not just many tours, but many years. And some of us spent, I spent something like 7 of my final 10 years deployed in various places engaged in these operations.
Wow. We recently, the United States recently set up a working group in Qatar, I believe, to have a conversation
Yes.
or start conversations with the Taliban. What do you see coming out of that? I mean, do we have anything to talk to them about?
We have a lot to talk to them about. There are still some US citizens left, largely people that just weren't all that keen to leave. But some of them will change their mind, especially if it's a really grim winter. There are some green card holders left. Again, these are quite modest numbers now. We've made every effort to get them out of the country. But more importantly, there are tens of thousands of special immigrant visa holders and special immigrant visa applicants and their family members, all of whom are entitled because of their 2 years or more service with our soldiers on the ground as battlefield interpreters, to come to the United States if they pass all the criteria. And we did not get all of them out. No One Left Behind, which is a great organization for anybody that wants to support this effort, I'm on their board of advisors. They have nearly 40,000 names of individuals who are in those categories. And it's many, many more. That's just what we've been able to collect in a flurry over the recent months, noting that neither of the previous two administrations ever really did what we should have done to get them out when the getting was good. And then, of course, there are even more who don't qualify for a special immigrant visa, but definitely qualify for asylum because of the threat posed to them and their family because of what they did, either working with us or in the Afghan government or in key positions, and they are left behind. So that's just number one. Number two, of course, to express our concerns about the Islamic State. I tend to agree with our Special Operations Command commander, who this past weekend at the conference in Canada stated that he doesn't see the Taliban as good counterterrorism partners, which is a bit of an understatement. But nonetheless, there may be some areas in which we ultimately have to share information. But beyond that, the big issue is going to be how to provide humanitarian assistance to fellow human beings who are facing the prospect of a very, very brutal winter, both in terms of just the sheer normal, terrible temperatures that are there, but also the privation when it comes to food and other sustenance and medical care this year.
And do you think we'll be able to get some of that humanitarian aid in?
Yes, very much so. And again, the Qataris, by the way, have been extraordinary partners in all of this. They're the ones I believe right now, perhaps together with some others, are helping to run Kabul International Airport as well. They were of enormous help when various groups that I was connected with were trying to get individuals out during those chaotic days of the masses of people around the entry control points at the airport. And our Emirati partners, Bahraini partners, Saudis, others, Kuwaitis, all allowed us to use bases on their soil when we're just hauling thousands of people out every day and trying to put them somewhere where they could be screened. Because, of course, the process at Kabul International Airport wasn't really conducive to the kind of orderly withdrawal and processing that one would normally have liked to have seen. And so they needed to be put in third countries until you could determine, have they got all their shots? What's the security situation? All the rest of this that needed to be seen to before they could be brought even to military bases in the US, from which the final processing could be done. And then they could be sent out to communities in the United States where they'd be supported for the early months of their time in our country.
President Biden has talked about this over the horizon using drones and Reapers and so on as the future of the warfare, at least in that part of the country, or part of the world. How do you see that developing? And is that the future of warfare, or how did you use that type of technology?
It's a very, very important capability. What drones have done has transformed the way we engage in these kinds of conflicts. If you remember, during the surge in Iraq, I was privileged to have 165,000 American men and women in uniform alone, and tens of thousands of coalition. And yet in large part because of this explosion in the armada of drones that we can bring to bear. When we went back into Iraq with the advent of the Islamic State controlling northern Iraq and western Iraq, we were able to, with 5,500 or 6,000 troops and a lot of drones and close air support and advisors and assistance and train and equip to enable the Iraqi security forces to defeat the Islamic State, and then to do the same with the Syrian Democratic Forces that we helped establish in northeastern Syria. So they are transformative. And, you know, I remember back to the early days, the fight to Baghdad, when there was one predator, a single platform, not one orbit, which would mean multiple platforms that are keeping one orbit in the sky 24/7, a single predator with a lousy feed over which 3 army divisions were fighting, each trying to establish why we needed it, watching what it is that we were doing. And then you think of the extraordinary number in the sky that enabled us to help our partners on the front lines to carry out the offensive operations, and then providing the precision munitions, and some from the drones, some from manned or other unmanned aircraft. So it's transformative. Now, that said, for the top of the line drone, the Reaper, it will probably use 50 to 65% of its blade time, its dwell time, its flight time, just getting to and from Afghanistan, assuming that they will come out of bases, say, in the Gulf states, Qatar, the UAE, maybe even one's a little bit closer in another country, because we sure can't afford to park an aircraft carrier off southern Pakistan to make it a more direct flight. And that's not the ideal platform on which to put drones in any event, given their other missions around the world. Drones right now are not refuelable, so that's another challenge. And again, they have limited carrying capacity depending on what it is you want to emphasize. Again, intelligence, surveillance, or reconnaissance, or strike. So, and beyond that, I've looked at a fair amount of, you know, drone feeds, and you're looking at a soda straw view of a world. And if you don't have folks on the ground and sources and other methods and other intelligence, it can look pretty confused to you. I watched, for example, part of the terrible night in Benghazi, where we repositioned the drone over that. But when no one was telling us what we were seeing, we didn't know whether these were good guys, bad guys, or good going bad because there's some shifted during the night, or what was really happening. So you have to have multiple sources of intelligence. First of all, even to know where to look, then to know what you think you're looking at, and to try to interpret what it is that you are seeing. And the value of these is best when they've been orbiting over something for hours, days, weeks, and you really get an understanding of that picture. And that is very hard to establish given how long a distance these are going to have to go. Now we'll put it back together, but keep in mind that Afghanistan was the last base location in which we had bases for the entire region. We have no bases in Central Asia anymore. We lost the base that we were using in Pakistan in the first decade or so after 9/11. So we are baseless right now, and that is going to be a big challenge. And so can this be done? Yes, it can be done. And oh, by the way, the Islamic State's going to be pretty occupied with the Taliban and Haqqani for a while. But the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy a week or two ago said that there's the possibility of the Islamic State posing a threat to our allies or even to us within 6 to 18 months. That's a pretty worst case picture, I'm sure, which is the cautious way to do that. But that is more than a bit alarming, and this is going to be very, very challenging.
Yeah, you went from Afghanistan into the CIA kind of as a straight shot. To what extent, while you were at the CIA, were you focused on Afghanistan, and sort of when you were in Afghanistan, what was your linkage with the CIA?
Well, I had very good linkage with the CIA for many, many years, really decades, starting, frankly, as the executive officer to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, when for 2 years, and I would actually be allowed to read the PDB while he was reading Presidential Daily Brief each morning. Every senior, the very senior people in the government all have their own briefer. That briefer comes in every morning with the Presidential Daily Brief. In some cases, if they're executive officers or chef de cabinet, if you will, are read on and permitted, they will allow them to read it as well. And that continued almost nonstop from there on out. The year that I was in Bosnia, I was not only the one-star chief of operations for NATO, I was dual-hatted as the deputy commander of a clandestine joint task force that was doing the war criminal hunt. It had the largest intelligence deployment in the world until 9/11 and the operations in Afghanistan. We shifted, not only did we get more war criminals in that 1 year, and we had a very close partnership with the station chief and deputy station chief and others that were there, and the FBI, by the way. But we then did the first counterterrorism operation after 9/11 in Sarajevo, and actually not in Afghanistan, because of intelligence that the CIA provided us. That just continued. I went to the 101st Airborne Division. We did the invasion of Iraq. One of the great heroes of the CIA literally rolls up in a pickup truck with a baseball cap on backwards behind a huge anti-aircraft artillery cannon and says, "Hey, Chief, I'm your chief of station or chief of base or whatever. Let me know what you need me to do," as we were engaged in the Battle of Najaf. And it just continued forever like that. As commander in Iraq, I had my own briefer, also a very close relationship with the chief of station. I broke with the CIA, actually with the intelligence community, on several national intelligence estimates, which never had happened before. The very first one was very explainable. They locked down their books a good 6 weeks before I testified at the 6-month mark of the surge. The progress that had just started a few weeks earlier continued quite dramatically. So it was a very different picture. And I broke with I didn't just have a footnote or an annex. I said, Mr. President, I fundamentally disagree with the assessment of the community. It's a good bit better but to be fair, they had to lock their books 6 weeks ago, and they understand why that was. That resulted in a very close partnership, because from then on, they wanted to ensure that when something went into the PDB on Iraq, I saw it in advance. I couldn't change it, or I could argue with them. We didn't generally do that. But what it meant was we welcomed analysts in station and I said, look, if you want to write something about the Iraqi security forces, you can embed someone with them. We have people embedded with them. You don't need to write it based on, international security or military review or parameters articles. Come on out. And it really fostered a great partnership. And that continued, again, nonstop. CENTCOM, I obviously had a briefer. I was actually quite actively involved with various station chiefs in countries where we did not have a 4-star, but where there were very substantial counter-terrorist operations ongoing. And in fact, served with a number of these individuals multiple times. So when I went there for these locations in particular, for the 20 or so countries that were the part of Central Command, and those that had been engaged in the war zones, we had a lot of great relationships on which to build. And indeed, we did focus a fair amount on Afghanistan and in the region, of course, Pakistan as well, because that was still where the remnants of Al-Qaeda were, in addition to a number of other countries. And then starting to shift, of course, the focus as the rebalance to Asia was launched, and appropriately focusing more and more on that, to the point that now the current director, of course, has publicly announced the establishment of a China center.
That's really interesting. Obviously, after leaving the CIA, you've now entered civilian life and have had a very interesting career with KKR. Can you tell us a little bit bring us up to date on David Petraeus today?
Well, I've been very, very fortunate to, Henry Kravis got hold of me when I left government, as did a couple of others, and said, when you want to come on up to New York, let's sit down. We think we might have something for you. And there were several different opportunities that were very, very attractive. KKR became the most attractive because after about 15 interviews, they said, you could do a lot more than be a senior advisor. Why don't you establish the KKR Global Institute? You can hire a few people. We can get a bunch of others on retainer. You can use your relationships. And what you will do is geopolitical risk analysis for us. and then integrate the macroeconomic analysis. We had a already great macro team, Henry McVeigh at the head of it, and then Ken Melman's environmental social governance issues analysis, which is part and parcel of the geopolitical risk. And they said, we think this is going to get more and more important in the years that lie ahead, and this could be a differentiator for our firm. It has proven to be that. We are involved in diligence on many of the deals where this is relevant. As I mentioned to you before the conversation started, I've actually vetoed a few deals actually. And generally in each case, several years later, the individuals on the financial side said, you were absolutely right. That was very attractive financially, but there were geopolitical and governance issues that you saw that would have prevented this from being a successful endeavor. We help our companies once we've made the investments in them. Of course, we own about 110 companies around the world, about $460 billion under management. And then we have minority interests in another 100 or so companies around the world as well. We've helped to essentially give the thumbs up for investments in countries where we'd not been before, Mexico, Philippines, Colombia, Chile, and some others in Southeast Asia. Ethiopia, we had a very good investment there during the period when governance was good, owned the largest rose grower in the world, had a very good exit, but it had issues during that time. And then we went in and we helped to work on mitigating the risks that are presented by those issues. We were in the former Yugoslavia, the only private equity firm of our size to do a large deal there. Every single one of those countries presented challenges and obstacles. Some required multiple visits. But if you go in with the US ambassador, who's always helping US industry, in the European Bank for Reconstruction Development, a co-investor, that's a pretty formidable trio to go into the front office of a government in these countries. And generally, we were able to resolve the issues and to enable that to be a very successful investment. I've found it very intellectually stimulating. I'm on the boards of two of the companies that we own as well. One is cybersecurity. I had some experience in the breaking and entering business over the years, and also the cybersecurity business. And then another is the largest, we believe, the best corporate performance management software platform in the world. And their growth in each case has been quite impressive. I'm a personal venture capitalist, invested in 20 startups, many multiple times, and several of those are already unicorns, touch wood. And then the teaching. And as you mentioned, I taught for 3.5 years at the City University in New York, was a fellow at Harvard for 6 years. I had a chair at University of Southern California for another 6 years, 1 week a semester. These have been very, very intellectually stimulating. They enable you to refresh your intellectual capital, to keep it up to date. And that, together with a lot of travel around the world to ensure that the relationships are maintained, is very, very helpful. And it has been very intellectually stimulating and rewarding.
Well, listening to you tonight, there's no doubt why we have a record attendance tonight for the Foreign Policy Association. And I just can't thank you enough for this extremely enlightening discussion. It's been wonderful having you. We appreciate it very much. And we hope this will help enlighten people on Afghanistan and what's happening today.
Well,
Thank you.
The pleasure really has been mine, Doug. Thanks so much. It's great to interact with you again, having done this a couple of times before. Let me again say thanks to the Foreign Policy Association for what it does and what it contributes to, again, the debates and discussions of the day. And also let me thank you for mentioning that it broke the record. Not that I'm in the least bit competitive, but perhaps that may not have to be under Chatham House rules.
Okay. Thanks again.
My pleasure. Thank you, Dan.